We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. It's a pleasure to present today Karachi Vice, Life and Death in a Contested City. Samira Shackle in conversation with H.M. Naqvi. Unearthing the deep underbelly of one of the world's most complex and precarious cities, Samira Shackle's debut book, Karachi Vice, Life and Death in a Contested City, is an intimate narrative steeped in local knowledge and a profound global perspective. A writer and journalist, Shackle is also the editor of the new Humanist magazine. H.M. Naqvi is the author of the novels Homeboy and the selected works of Abdullah the Cossack, and the winner of the DSC Prize for the South Asian Literature. In conversation with Naqvi, Shackle unfolds individual and personal experience to give us a ringside view of the last decade of a city marred by politics and violence. Samira Shackle is a freelance Pakistani writer and reporter based in London. She is the editor of the New Humanist magazine and a regular contributor to the Guardian long read. Her first book, Karachi Vice, tells the story of 5 ordinary citizens of Pakistan's largest city. H.M. Naqvi is a Karachi-based award-winning novelist. His debut, Homeboy, was hailed as remarkably engaging novel that delights as it disturbs by the New York Times and awarded the DSC Prize in 2011. His second novel is the selected works of Abdullah the Cossack. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comments section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Karachi Vice, Life and Death in a Contested City. Samira Shackle in conversation with H.M. Naqvi. Enjoy the conversation.
Samira Shackle, how are you? How is life in London these days?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks. Life in London is locked down and a bit dark, but other than that, fine. We had a sunny weekend this weekend for the first time in ages. How about you? Life in Karachi?
I think it's 82 degrees Fahrenheit here in spring, and it goes down to 60 in the evening. So although things are otherwise grim, the sun is out.
Nice. That's something. That is something.
You have just come out with Karachi Vice, and I was thinking Karachi, unlike London, is, depending on how you cut the numbers, the 6th largest city in the world. And it seems to me that it has often been overlooked by discourse. As a novelist, I can tell you that as a child, I remember for the first time when the city appeared on the page for me. It was in a forgotten novel called The 13th House by Adam Zameenzaad. I came across it again in Zeba Sadiq's 38 Bahadrabad, and a lovely piece by Sarah Soleri in Granta. And, it was the first time that this city was sort of reified in prose. Subsequently, of course, things have changed. Karachi in recent years has appeared in Umar Shahid's thrillers, Saba Imtiaz's Karachi, You're Killing Me, and Bilal Tanveer's The Scatter Hairs Too Great, to name a few. During this time, I also remember that it appeared in publications like Time and Newsweek, and by the occasional foreign correspondent passing through from Islamabad. But that also has changed, because in recent years, NPR's Steve Inskeep wrote a lovely book called Instant City, and this Frenchman, Laurent Gaillet, did this sort of very diligent sociological survey that has dug into unsettled periods of recent history. Your book is a welcome addition to the non-fiction lens, before we talk about your book, I just wanted to understand your relationship to the city.
Yeah, so my relationship to the city, I guess, started from a personal place. It's my mother's hometown, so my whole maternal family is from there. And my mother and her siblings grew up there and moved to London when she was in her 20s, so it's like the 70s. So I had that connection, and it was a place that I'd heard about a lot in childhood. I spent a bit of time there in very early childhood, but I was kind of too young to remember really. But it was a place that I had a kind of connection to, but I hadn't really been to very much through most of my life until I was in my 20s. Partly because my family traveled a lot, so came through London, and our family's kind of scattered all over the place. And so people kind of passed through London, and that was the sort of convergence point. But I was interested in getting to know Pakistan and specifically Karachi, and a kind of personal and professional interest converged, I guess, because I went freelance about getting on for 10 years ago. I think it was 9 years ago. I was working at a magazine in London. I went freelance. I knew I wanted to live somewhere other than the UK for a while, and I also knew I wanted to connect with that aspect of my heritage more. So I just moved in with some relatives in Karachi and lived there and started working as a freelance journalist. And then I was there in Pakistan for a year, 6 months in Karachi, 6 months in Islamabad for covering the election. But after that, although I moved back to the UK, I was still interested, and I felt I was only kind of beginning to understand the different dynamics and so on. So I kind of kept coming back, both for work and to visit friends and family and so on. And so it kind of drew me in, I guess, and I kept wanting to return and know more. And I don't know, I guess many big cities are, but it seemed to me a place that was particularly full of stories and storytellers, which is very appealing as a storyteller myself.
Okay. As you now know, Karachi is sort of, the stories, there are, it's a city full of stories. It's a complicated city. How did you conceive of the intriguing sort of structure of Karachi Vice? Karachi Vice, of course, is sort of a very brisk and pacey sort of set of profiles, portraits of different characters in the city, different stories. How did you go about structuring this in that way?
Sure. So the book actually originally grew out of two newspaper features that I'd done. One was a profile of a crime reporter in Karachi for The Guardian, and then one about a year later was a profile of an ambulance driver for the ED ambulance service. And in the course of doing those two pieces, I was really struck that they had these two men didn't know each other at all. They lived in kind of quite different worlds and professional spheres and class backgrounds and everything, but they had their jobs kind of brought them into contact with the different conflicts and issues that had been going on in the city for the preceding 10, 15 years that they'd been working. And so they talked to me in the course of interviewing them and following them around their work. They'd both experienced lots of the same events and been at these same, because obviously there's so much going on, and particularly over the last couple of decades, there's been so much happening, but there have been these few big moments that have affected many people in certain ways. Like, for instance, they'd both been there when the airport was attacked in 2014, and the crime reporter was covering it for his news channel. The ambulance driver was doing some first response rescue work. And so there were some points like that where I thought there are these big incidents that have kind of touched different people, and that sort of got me thinking about an idea for a book. And so it kind of grew from that, really. And I knew then that I wanted to tell both of those two, I should clarify, are in the final book. Safdar is the ambulance driver and Zaleh is the journalist. And then I knew that there were certain aspects of different stories that I wanted to tell. I wanted to look at the gang war in Liari, which had been a very kind of defining story for many years. I wanted to talk about ethnic conflict in Orangi town, again, a kind of big issue. And I wanted to talk about people who were facing displacement because of property development. And so I sort of started looking for those final three people with that in mind, really.
Tell me about Parveen. I, of course, read her sort of her profile, and I also I heard somebody else reading the profile on a podcast, I think, complete with the accents. Tell me about Parveen. She's a very sort of a very compelling figure that is a resident of Liari, which is has been a troubled canton in Karachi, much like perhaps Dongri in Mumbai.
Yeah, so she's from Liari, as you say, which has this area that's been the center of a gang war intermittently over the last couple of decades. And she's a really amazing person. She's got this incredible moral core, was the thing that's so striking about her. She's got a really strong sense of right and wrong. And I think often in a place where you have the state has kind of receded in many ways, and you have criminal elements stepping in to take over some of those basic municipal functions in a way. But people are forced to have quite a flexible attitude, I think, a lot of the time, and to perhaps the thing she was very up in arms about was social workers and charity workers locally deciding when Uzair Baloch, the particular gang lord, was in power, deciding they were going to cooperate in order to get their local development work done. And she never wanted to compromise at all, which kind of brought her into quite a lot of personal danger at different points. She's also a woman who is incredibly funny. And I mean, big passages of the parts of the book that are about her are pretty much verbatim from her storytelling. I think I could have written a whole book just about her, because she's just such a storyteller. And she's quite defiant in the way she lives her life as well. She's from quite a conservative, not affluent area and family, and she's very determined that she doesn't want to get married. She wants to focus on her work, and she thinks that marriage might bring restrictions. She's quite defiant about the sort of social conventions that many women feel compelled to live by. And she's incredibly active in all sorts of, I think I covered a fraction of the things she does. She's sort of protesting against enforced disappearances in Balochistan, which is where her ancestral home is. She's setting up mobile libraries for areas that don't have access to books. She's doing these plays, which I don't think this is in the book in the end, like street theatre about early marriage and domestic violence, to sort of educate people about those issues. So yeah, she's a real force of nature.
There's this sort of, well, let me ask you, so you sat down with her and then she narrated sort of her tale, so to speak, right? Yeah. There's this very poignant, face-off where she stares down and holds her ground against one Uzair Baloch, who was until recently the sort of most prominent of Karachi's of Liari's gangsters. Would you like to tell me what happened, or how it happened?
Sure. So this was, as you say, in the period where he was really kind of running the area. It's often described as the Don of Liari or the Sadar of Liari. And so Parveen had been involved for a long time in local community work, and she'd moved out of the area actually because of threats to her family. So she was living in another area, but still working in Liari a lot. And she'd been quite horrified to see that lots of the people she'd worked with for many years were cooperating with Uzair in order, because he was kind of running everything. So all sort of initiatives that you wanted to do locally needed to go through him. His gang also had a kind of vested interest in promoting themselves as kind of Robin Hood type figures, because to sort of keep some favor among local people, basically, to keep their control of the area. But she didn't like this at all. However, she needed to raise some money for some floods that had happened in Balochistan. And a friend said, look, you're raising money from everyone. Why don't you ask for money from this guy? Because like the flood victims don't care where the money comes from. You need to put your principal aside, basically. So she kind of thought, okay, fine. Her friend was going along anyway. So she went with him to the meeting. And she described it to me. He had this huge kind of mansion in an area where people live in very kind of tightly packed, overcrowded accommodation and so on. And it was this huge sort of decadent mansion with a big water feature, and she could hear some screams coming from a torture cell that was behind the main hall. And she was asking for the money, but it sort of ended up, they were familiar with her, asking her if she would come and work for them, the gangsters. And she was really outraged about this, and essentially ended up giving them a piece of her mind, until the friend who was with her said, "You really need to calm down and show some respect." And she left. And then one of the things that really struck me about it was that her mother afterwards didn't get out of bed, she said, for several days because she was so worried. And of course, I forgot the important thing was she got there and realized her cousin, who she thought was a civil servant, was working as a bodyguard for the gangster, and he was holding a gun at her the whole way through the encounter. So she was just completely disoriented. And that wasn't unusual because there was so much collaboration between the gangs and the kind of local government as well. Yeah, so it was really a kind of interweaving of the personal and the political, and great personal risk.
You know, I once attended, once every 4 years, there's this sort of what you could call a Pax Leariana, right? And that's usually during the World Cup. And during the World Cup, the fighting stops.
Yeah.
Because
I was there in the World Cup a couple of years ago. Yeah.
And the sort of denizens of Leari are some of the best sort of soccer players, football players, Pakistan produces. And so, you know, and they are mostly Brazil fans. And so I thought I would go attend the final in Leari with some journalist friends of mine. And we were sitting there, and there were maybe 1,500 people down one of the main arteries there. And there was this giant screen that had been put up by Uzair. And so one watched the match there. And at halftime, he knew that there were some outsiders in his neighborhood, within his purview. So he called us. And I met, and so sort of I was expecting somebody like Rahman Dekayat or Baba Ladla or Zikri, the sort of old school gangsters that ran Leari. But here was a man who was sort of this very well-spoken young man who said, you know, we need money for stadiums, otherwise the youth of this canton will resort to to crime and so, you know, he was not what I expected, but of course he was also someone who collected extorted the Leari and the adjacent neighborhoods and so on. So, and I also, will tell you that I know the person whose house, whose factory was taken away, and which was adjacent to his house, and that's where his swimming pool and that fountain is. So it's a small plot that was taken away. You know, the stories that you the stories that you have depicted here are reminded me of other books in this vein, in particular From Dongri to Dubai by Hussain Zaidi, which is about it's here. By Hussain Zaidi, which is about Dongri, where I've also spent some time. And also, one of my favorite books in this vein is my friend's book, Maximum City, Sukhitu Mehta's Maximum City.
Yeah.
And Maximum City is different in ways, but similar in that he follows an actor, an aspiring actor, somebody who was involved, who had killed people during the Mumbai riots in the early 90s, sort of a contract killer, and a courtesan. It's a fascinating book, but it is, it's not the Bombay of today, it's the Bombay of the 90s. And I was wondering, how does your book depict a time and a place that is sort of still present, or it's an incarnation of a city that keeps evolving and keeps changing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think inevitably, I guess, a book that's about specific events in a specific period of time in people's lives will be of its time. I think at the moment the final chapters sort of take place right up till 2018. 2019 even, so there's it's still quite current now. I'm sure that the city will keep evolving, and even over the period of time that the book really focuses in on, the city did change a lot. I mean, one of the kind of central events in it is this big crackdown that happened, and how all these different forces have been, at least for the time being, been brought under control somewhat, and the lives of the people I've followed really did change quite drastically from after about 2015 or so. So yeah, I wanted to capture that evolution of the city, although it kind of focuses primarily on the last 10 years or so, but obviously takes in a bit of the history before that, and so on. So I wanted to capture some of that, because cities, I think that's one of the things that's so compelling about all cities, especially really big ones, is just the way that they do evolve and change, and even physically the kind of and especially somewhere like Karachi, where you have such a like the kind of boundaries of the city itself are so mutable and changeable, and it's expanding and shifting all the time. So yeah, I'm sure that in years to come, this book will be a snapshot of a particular period, but I hope it captures something of that evolution.
Sure.
Yeah.
Tell me, Samira, you've also spent time in another megalopolis, Lagos, which in my mind, I haven't spent time in Lagos, but in my mind, it's sort of analogous. How would you characterize the similarities and differences between Lagos and, say, Karachi?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't spent nearly as much time in Lagos as I have in Karachi, of course, but yeah, I would agree. I think it is analogous in some ways, in that the very rapid expansion. I think the fact that it's probably both places in some ways are quite difficult places to live. You have a lot of traffic and a lot of crowding, and maybe the infrastructure hasn't kept pace with the population, and yet alongside those kind of difficulties that can be involved in day-to-day life, there's a huge kind of people have a huge passion for their city despite those things, and I think that's quite comparable in both places. I think Lagos has also had some issues with crime and violence and so on, and gangs and organized crime, and similarly in a sort of complicated different mesh. I think it holds the same sort of in the nation, the same sort of place as Karachi, and that they're both these kind of big economic hearts that are the place where the kind of archetypal way people view a city as a place you can make your fortune and go, and so people keep going despite the fact that it can also be quite hard to do so. And I think on another point, there's one of the things I talk about in the book is the this huge development at the edge of the city, Baria town, and Nigeria. In Lagos, there's quite a similar, maybe not on quite the same scale, but a similar kind of huge private property development happening as well, which is kind of gated and walled off and being built over some other already existing communities. So there's lots of comparisons to make, I think.
I was wondering, we're meeting for the first time face to face. I was wondering, are you in the mood to read something from Karachi Vice so one gets a sense of the staccato, pacey sort of narration, storytelling that you have,
Sure, I can read something.
Yeah.
Maybe I could read from the start of the part about Parveen, since we've been talking about her.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me find it.
This is unrehearsed and this is real time and live, and so.
Yeah, forgive me if I stumble. I'll just
No.
Okay, yeah. So I'll read from the start of where Parveen is introduced, and it introduces the area through her eyes. They called it a slum, but Liari was Parveen's home in all its overcrowded glory. The area was as old as Karachi, not like the newer settlements that had sprung up on the periphery of the city as the population expanded. The history was there in the architecture, the tall and majestic old apartment blocks of a bygone era, painted in pastel colors with ornate but depleted plasterwork, like aging aristocrats who had fallen on hard times. They stood cheek by jowl with squat concrete buildings, crammed in to accommodate a swelling populace, structures so close together that there seemed to be no gap between them at all. Some were topped with rusting corrugated iron sheets, held down crudely with bricks on each corner, others with half-finished plaster, the metal webbing still visible, as if the buildings had been caught in a state of undress. Throughout her teenage years, Parveen had seen street schools. One in particular stuck in her mind, a place she had spotted as she walked between two relatives' homes in the late 1990s. It seemed like a small oasis of order in an otherwise chaotic place. Students of all ages were squatting on a rug laid out on the street, squinting at the chalkboard through the afternoon sunlight and the clouds of dust kicked up by auto rickshaws and motorbikes speeding past. The demarcations of the school were daubed onto the wall of the building behind it in paint, a crudely strung up curtain on each side, giving the impression, if not the actuality, of privacy. People crossed over the road to walk on the other side so as not to interrupt the lessons. In one form or another, street schools had been running in Liari since the 1960s, free open-air teaching set up by the community to counteract endemic government neglect. Some kids were sent there to augment the teaching they got at underfunded government schools, or because their parents wanted to keep them occupied and away from drug dealers. Others, older teenagers, a few adults, had jobs as day laborers or in factories. Liari was a poor area. Many people dropped out of school to work, only to find later that their career prospects were limited by illiteracy. Parveen, who had always wanted to do something for her people, knew she had to find out more. In 2001, when Parveen was 19 and had only just finished her own education, she got a teaching job. Although they called it a street school, the establishment on Liari's Shahbeg Lane, where she worked, sat atop a building a few stories high, hemmed in by low perimeter walls and wooden boards painted bright green. From up here, you could see the familiar higgledy-piggledy buildings of Liari stretching out on all sides. The school taught Urdu reading and writing, basic English and maths. Parveen loved teaching and finding out about her students' lives, but she also loved organizing, and within a year she was involved in the day-to-day management of the school. Sometimes she and another teacher would take an auto rickshaw out of the area, through the warren of congested alleys and under the cartoonish yellow arches that shouted, "Welcome to Liari town," in English and Urdu. From here, the city opened out onto a wide freeway, a vast expanse of tarmac and cars, and they'd ride all the way to Urdu Bazaar, a hectic cluster of stalls and shops selling books and stationery on Muhammad Ali Jinnah Road. Here, they would seek out the secondhand stores that stocked battered textbooks, sometimes with pages missing or scrawls in the margins, whatever they could find to supplement their teaching. Stop there.
Yeah, I think that's, I think, it gives us a sense and a flavor of your sense of your project and flavor of your prose. I wanted to ask you, you studied journalism at Oxford?
I studied English literature at Oxford, actually.
English literature at Oxford, okay.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, do you find that literature sort of informs the literary discourse, literature informs the way that you come at these stories? I mean, because these are just very compelling stories, and so do you think that feeds into it?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I was quite consciously with this book, I wanted to use some devices of fiction. I think I wanted it to be first and foremost a story that people wanted to read. And you're a bit more free to do that with a book than with journalism for a newspaper. Although in particularly the last 5 years or so, I guess the kind of journalism I increasingly do is more narrative. So you do have a bit more leeway to kind of have a sense of a beginning, middle, and end, I guess, and try and show the people you're writing about as characters and in a kind of emotional way. So yeah, definitely. I guess I thought it's quite strange to talk about something like plotting when you're talking about structuring a nonfiction book, because you're kind of selecting from people's real experiences that they've told you about. But I did kind of think about the narrative shape of it and wanting people to sort of empathize with those people as I had and sort of get a sense of what they were like. That's why someone like Parveen, and actually most of the people I spoke to for the book was such a gift, because she was so vivid in the way she spoke that you could kind of really feel like you were there for her.
So yeah. How was Parveen different from, say, Siraj, who runs in an architectural
sort of actor? Well, he also was, I mean, all of the people, I should say, were incredibly generous with their time and recollections. And I was interviewing people over the course of months and in some cases years. Parveen was different to Siraj because Siraj is a very serious person who also spoke in a lot of detail, actually, and was incredibly generous with his recollections, but he's very, very focused on his work. And maybe I needed to, it took some more time to draw out the more kind of emotional side of things, I think. And once we'd got to know each other a bit, that got easier. That might also be to do with the difference between men and women, I guess, and how you're used to relaying your experiences. It's maybe focus a bit more on the factual and so on. But yeah, people just talk, and it's interesting. Yeah, sort of profiling 5 different people, and people just talk in such different ways. The strand of the story in the village, at the sort of urban rural settlement, this is the community that's vulnerable to displacement. The woman I ended up focusing on there, Jannat, was partly because she was a bit more forthcoming than some of the others I spoke to. But everyone in that village had basically, especially the women, only ever really interacted with the same kind of 200 or 300 people in their vicinity. And so you just have a slightly different relationship to memory, I think. You just don't need to relay your experiences with the same kind of context that you might if you live in a city and you're used to interacting with people who don't know anything about you. So that took quite a lot of, that was probably one of the most challenging ones to do, but I was so fascinated to kind of spend time there and see how people lived and talk to them. So yeah, it kind of carried me through.
So there are some people, there's some people that lend themselves to sort of to conversation and lend themselves to a compelling story, right? Out of curiosity, were the people that you worked with that didn't make it into the book, or
yeah, definitely. There was a few. Yeah, before deciding who to include, I spoke to quite a few different people, and there were people who it just wouldn't work. Some people had amazing life experiences, but if people aren't really, not everyone is willing or able to kind of talk in incredible detail about things that happened to them 10 years ago, and which I do have some sympathy with. It's probably quite an exhausting thing to do. So yeah, that was definitely part of the process of figuring out, because it just has to be yeah, has to be kind of possible, and someone has to be happy to do that kind of, I guess it's kind of collaborating in a way, but has to be happy to let you in. Because I spent quite a lot of time with people and spoke to their families and colleagues and so on as well, just by virtue of being around a lot. So yeah, there were definitely, like for the ambulance driver, before I did the original story, spoke to a few different ambulance drivers, and he was the one who was just kind of jumped out as someone who was happy to. He's also a hilarious character. It's really
he jumps out of the pages. He's
so, I'm so glad.
So animate.
He's an amazing person.
You know, I find, you know, one has lived in this city through some sort of dark days, and you know, these periods have, you know, Karachi in the 90s was rough. 2008 to 2013 was particularly rough. And then, you know, then there the sort of the cycles. And what I find fascinating, you know, Siraj is of course an ambulance driver for ED. These sort of
yeah.
And you know, what I find fascinating is when in the absence of competent municipal machinery, in this vacuum, you get characters like you know, the gangsters that populated Liari, and you also get figures like Abdullah Ebi, who created from scratch the largest sort of ambulance service in Pakistan, and sort of an entire network of orphanages and sort of civic institutions. And it's more than ED. You know, SIUT, Adib Rizvi's SIUT is a world-class hospital. Parveen Rahman and the sort of Orangi pilot project has been cited by the UN as sort of a way of uplifting entire neighborhoods, and there's you know, sort of initiatives like these that the CPLC, the Citizens, the CPLC was a public-private partnership that fought crime, and so in the absence of or the sort of where the state is not capable or is not willing to sort of engage with this, you know, what its responsibilities, then sort of there are these private initiatives that take on the role of the state.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something I wanted to show. Was like one of the things I was really fascinated by was how, first of all, how ordinary life, I guess, carries on in between sometimes quite extreme circumstances. Like if you're a person that lives in Liari while the area is being kind of consumed by a battle between gangs, and how do you sort of carry on your normal day to day? And yet people do, they start families, they get jobs, they do, and they do more than that. They do things to really kind of help and work for their communities. And that was what I kind of saw all over. And I guess most of the people in the book are united by that. They're sort of doing things which no one's making them in a way do some of these things, but sometimes being at great personal risk for very little personal gain to make things better, not just for themselves and their for themselves and their families, but for the people around them. And I think that that's something very inspiring and very hopeful, actually, that you might have these very bad periods, but there are always people, and not powerful people, but just people sort of trying to do something in their small way to improve things.
Yeah, ED was sort of ED Sahab, sort of saintly, and he was he started off life as a selling pan on the sidewalk, and sort of, you know, from there,
Yeah, the huge operation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I've asked you sort of. I've monopolized your time with my questions. I thought we would take some questions from our audience.
Great.
So Ananya asks, how did your experience as a member of the South Asian diaspora community impact your approach in writing Karachi Vice, if at all?
That's interesting. I think, as I said at the start, probably being from the diaspora is what initially prompted my interest. I think, yeah, that's a big part of it. I'm also kind of, I think, aware that as someone who is from the diaspora, you have a personal connection, but you're kind of part insider, part outsider, I think. So you are kind of, you're not fully of the place. And so having that sort of awareness, which sometimes can help you to do, to sort of really do your research, I guess, because I'm sort of aware that I might have this link, but I don't have the same claim to Karachi as I do to London, for instance, where I've spent all my life. So I think that probably, as well as that initial connection, just really encouraged me to sort of do the work to really try to understand, I think.
Do you think that you also, given your background, people were willing to talk to you in a way that they wouldn't talk to somebody who didn't have any connection to?
I think so. Yeah, I do think so. Yeah, I think people tend to like it. This is just a sort of initial connection, in a sense that there's maybe some kind of implicit understanding there. I think it does make a difference for sure.
Because with Jannat, for instance, you said, she probably didn't, she probably interacted only with a certain, within her ecosystem, she probably hadn't spoken to somebody outside. And if it weren't for a connection, perhaps you wouldn't have been able to.
Perhaps. Yeah, I think it definitely does make a difference. People like it. And as I got to know people better interviewing them, they enjoyed mocking me for my very terrible. Like, it's easy, you should learn better.
Yeah. Well, another question from Niharika is, what do you think, how certain ideas, perceptions of cities dominate popular thinking, and in many cases impacts the kind of work written about these places?
Well, it's quite a broad question. I think it's true that you definitely get kind of particular narratives about particular places, don't you? Like, and I think for a long time about Karachi, it's just been like, it's violent, or generally about Pakistan, I think the narrative was very entrenched, like internationally, it's sort of terrorism, full stop, and that's that. So yeah, I think that's definitely true. You see it other cities around the world, the narrative might be like, this is booming, you have the whole rising India thing or whatever. So you have those kind of negative and positive connotations for places. And I think that when you're writing about a place, you're obviously aware of what those stereotypes are, but hopefully the kind of detail is where you can kind of surpass that, maybe by looking at I'm always really interested in less in the sort of big geopolitical side of things, and much more in kind of in all the work I do, actually, and sort of how does this affect ordinary people, and what is the kind of lived experience of these big events, and what's the kind of knock-on effect. And so hopefully that kind of goes beyond stereotypes a bit, or kind of maybe stereotypes isn't even the word, like the big sort of conceived narratives.
Last question for you. What's next?
What's next? Well, I've been thinking that lots of people have been like, oh, what's your next book? I'm like, I have absolutely no idea. I'm amazed by people who can just finish one and start writing another. I don't know. I feel like my brain is just recovering. So I'm just focusing on some journalism for the moment, and hopefully another book idea will emerge. But obviously we're all stranded, so I'm mostly doing UK focused stuff and dreaming of being able to travel. I'm very wishful that we're not in Jaipur right now, to be honest.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
When do you get jabbed?
I don't know yet. I think I'm quite low on the list. They're going through HYs. Soon, I hope.
Great. Well, it's lovely talking to you, and I hope
Likewise.
that next time you're in Karachi, we'll meet face to face, not merely virtually.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you so much. Thanks for all the questions as well, and thanks all the audience too.
Thank you, Samira.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samira, and thank you, HM Naqvi, for a really fascinating conversation. We would also like to thank our celebration partner, Diageo. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 @JaipurLitFest. Remember, the festival is protected by Dettol. Thank you so much and hope to see you in the next session. Thank you.